In the autumn of 1918, as church bells rang across Britain to celebrate the armistice, a different kind of silence descended upon Birmingham. The city's streets, once patrolled by experienced constables who knew every corner and every face, now echoed with an emptiness that spoke not of peace, but of absence. The war had ended, but it had taken with it something far more valuable than the lives claimed on foreign battlefields. It had taken order itself. Consider for a moment what happens when authority simply vanishes, not through revolution or conquest, but through attrition, a slow bleeding away of the very people whose presence maintains the fabric of civil society. Birmingham's police force had sent its finest to the trenches. Sergeants who had walked these beats for 20 years, constables who could diffuse a pub fight with a word and a steady gaze, detectives who held in their minds the intricate web of the city's criminal networks. They left for France and Belgium. Many never returned. The ones who did come back found a Birmingham transformed. The factories that had hummed with munitions production now fell silent, their workers suddenly surplus to requirements. The men who returned from Passchendaele and the Somme, who had mastered the machinery of industrial killing, who had learned to function in chaos and violence, came home to find no jobs, no prospects, no place for the skills they had been forced to acquire. They had been promised a land fit for heroes. Instead, they found themselves adrift in a city that seemed to have forgotten them entirely. Walk through Small Heath in those months after the war, and you would have witnessed something remarkable, a city holding its breath. The pubs overflowed each evening with men who drank to forget what they had seen, what they had done, what they had become. In the betting shops that clustered around the racecourses, money changed hands in amounts that would have seemed impossible before the war. Gambling had always existed, of course, but now it carried a different energy. These men had survived the lottery of artillery shells and machine gun fire. What was a bet on a horse race compared to that? The betting industry in Birmingham represented something extraordinary, an economic ecosystem operating almost entirely outside formal regulation. Cash flowed through it like water through a broken dam, and no one quite knew where it all went or who controlled it. Before the war, informal understandings and long-established territories had maintained a rough equilibrium, but the war had shattered those arrangements. The men who had controlled the betting pitches at the racecourses, who had enforced the unwritten rules, many of them were gone. Their absence created something that strategic minds recognize immediately: opportunity. Imagine being a young man in Birmingham in 1919. You are 23 years old. You have spent 3 years learning to kill efficiently, to operate in small units with absolute trust in your comrades, to identify weaknesses in enemy positions and exploit them without mercy. You have survived while thousands around you died, not through luck alone, but through intelligence, through reading situations faster than others, through decisive action when hesitation meant death. Now you stand in a dole queue, or you work 12 hours in a factory for wages that barely cover rent in a tenement where 6 families share a single toilet. The society that sent you to die now offers you poverty as a reward. And then you notice something. You notice that the bookmakers at the racecourses operate openly, taking thousands of pounds in bets with no police intervention. You notice that small shop owners pay informal fees to certain men to ensure their windows remain intact. You notice that the men who control these informal systems, these protection arrangements, these betting territories, they seem to have money when no one else does. They have respect when returning soldiers receive only neglect. The arithmetic is simple. Brutal perhaps, but simple. The Peaky Blinders did not emerge from nowhere. They were not a spontaneous outbreak of criminality. They were the product of specific conditions, a perfect storm of circumstances that created both the opportunity and the motivation for organized crime to flourish. Their story begins not with individual criminals, but with systematic failure, the failure of society to reintegrate its warriors, the failure of government to maintain order during transition, the failure of the economy to provide legitimate opportunity. Thomas Gilbert understood these conditions. So did Ernest Bales and Harry Fowles. These were not illiterate thugs, though that is how newspapers would later portray them. They were calculating men who recognized that Birmingham in 1918 and 1919 existed in a state of strategic opportunity that might never come again. The old order had collapsed. The new order had not yet formed. In that gap, power belonged to whoever could seize it most effectively. The police force that remained in Birmingham, depleted, demoralized, and overwhelmed, faced an impossible task. Budget cuts imposed by a government desperate to reduce war debt meant fewer constables patrolling larger areas. The experienced officers, the ones who might have recognized and countered emerging threats, were either dead or broken by their war service. The new recruits, young men without experience, found themselves policing streets they barely knew, facing men who had survived the Western Front and feared nothing a police constable might threaten. Consider the mathematics of the situation. Before the war, Birmingham's police force numbered approximately 1,000 men serving a population of 500,000. By 1919, the force had shrunk to fewer than 700 officers, while the population had grown and the crime rate had exploded. Each constable now covered nearly twice the territory with half the institutional knowledge. Response times stretched from minutes to hours. Investigations that would have once been routine now overwhelmed available resources. Political attention, meanwhile, focused elsewhere entirely. Parliament concerned itself with Irish independence, with labour strikes threatening coal production, with the influenza pandemic that killed more Britons than the war itself. The Home Office, responsible for domestic security, found itself stretched impossibly thin. Local government in Birmingham, dominated by businessmen whose primary concern was economic recovery, viewed the police budget as an expendable luxury. Crime in working-class neighbourhoods generated far less political urgency than stabilising trade with the Empire. This created what military strategists call a gap in the line, an undefended position that invites exploitation. The Peaky blinders recognised this gap instinctively. They had learned in the trenches to identify weakness and attack it immediately before the enemy could reinforce. Birmingham's compromised police force represented exactly such a weakness, but opportunity alone does not create criminal empire. The Peaky blinders succeeded because they recognised multiple convergent opportunities and moved to exploit them simultaneously. The betting industry represented their primary target, and for good reason. Gambling on horse racing had existed in Britain for centuries, but the early 20th century saw it transform into a mass phenomenon. Working men who previously might place an occasional shilling on a local race now bet regularly, sometimes daily. The war had accelerated this trend. Soldiers in the trenches had gambled constantly on card games, on lice races, on which of them would survive the next attack. Gambling became a psychological pressure valve, a way to assert control over fate when everything felt random and deadly. When these men returned to Birmingham, they brought this gambling habit with them. The city's racecourses, Castle Bromwich, Sutton Park, and others within easy reach, hosted meetings that drew thousands. The amounts wagered grew exponentially. But here is what made it so attractive to criminal enterprise. It remained almost entirely unregulated. No licenses were required to operate as a bookmaker. No records were kept. No taxes were paid. Cash moved from punters to bookmakers with no paper trail, no oversight, no authority asking questions. The economic potential was staggering. A successful bookmaker at a busy race meeting might take in £500 in bets, the equivalent of a factory worker's wages for 5 years in a single afternoon, and the overhead costs were minimal. A bookmaker needed chalk for writing odds, a stand to be visible, and most importantly, the ability to ensure he would not be robbed by competitors or have his pitch stolen. This last requirement opened the door for organised crime. Bookmakers needed protection, both from each other and from independent thieves. They needed someone to guarantee their territorial rights to enforce agreements, to ensure debts were paid. Before the war, informal networks had provided this security, but those networks had dissolved. Now, there was a market opportunity: provide security to bookmakers in exchange for a percentage of their take. The Peaky Blinders moved into this space with military precision. They identified key racecourses and began offering protection to bookmakers, protection that was not optional. A bookmaker who refused might find himself beaten, his stand destroyed, his customers intimidated into going elsewhere. A bookmaker who agreed paid typically 10% of his day's take and operated without interference. More importantly, he operated under guarantee that no rival would challenge his pitch, that no debts would go unpaid, that the day's profits would make it safely home. This represented a form of taxation, criminal taxation, but taxation nonetheless. The Peaky Blinders created a system where money flowed from the betting public through bookmakers to the gang, with violence serving as the enforcement mechanism that government usually provides through courts and police. But they understood something deeper than simple extortion. They recognized that successful protection rackets depend on actually providing protection. A bookmaker paying for security needed to feel secure. If rivals still attacked him, if debts remained unpaid, if he was robbed on the way home, the arrangement had no value. The Peaky Blinders therefore became genuinely effective at maintaining order within the territories they controlled. Bookmakers under their protection operated more profitably than independents because they faced fewer disruptions and lower risks. This illustrates a profound truth about criminal organizations. The successful ones provide real services, even if those services are funded by coercion. The Peaky Blinders were not simply parasites. They created a system that functioned, that delivered value to participants, that maintained internal logic and rules. Their violence was not random but strategic, applied precisely where needed to maintain the system's integrity. Consider the psychology of this arrangement from the bookmaker's perspective. You operate in a grey market, handling large amounts of cash, with no legal recourse if things go wrong. The police cannot help you. Gambling debts are not enforceable in court, and involving authorities might trigger scrutiny of your own activities. You need some form of order, some guarantee of security. The Peaky Blinders offer exactly that. Yes, they take a percentage, but in exchange you gain protection that has real value. The arrangement makes economic sense, even if you resent the men behind it. The alcohol trade provided another convergent opportunity. Though Britain never implemented full prohibition like America, wartime restrictions on alcohol production and sales continued into peacetime. Licensing laws limited pub hours. Taxes on spirits rose dramatically to fund war debt repayment. This created profitable smuggling opportunities. Irish whiskey brought in through Liverpool, French brandy through southern ports, industrial alcohol diverted from factories and redistilled for consumption. Birmingham's position in the British Midlands made it ideal for smuggling operations. The city sat at the crossroads of canal and rail networks, connecting ports with inland markets. Large industrial facilities processed chemicals that could be diverted. A sophisticated criminal organization could purchase untaxed alcohol elsewhere, transport it through Birmingham's labyrinthine warehouse districts, distribute it to pubs and illegal drinking establishments, and generate substantial profits. The Peaky Blinders moved into this trade as well, recognizing that their protection networks among pub owners provided ready distribution channels. A pub owner already paying for security could easily be persuaded to purchase alcohol from the same source. The gang effectively vertically integrated their operations, controlling supply, distribution, and retail, all while using violence to eliminate competition. Small businesses throughout Birmingham faced a similar proposition. Shop owners, market vendors, warehouse operators, anyone handling cash or merchandise existed in a landscape where police protection was unreliable at best. The Peaky Blinders offered an alternative. Pay a regular fee and your business remains undisturbed. Refuse, and you might face broken windows, stolen goods, customers intimidated away, or worse. This protection racket business model possessed elegant economics. Unlike theft, which generates one-time returns, protection payments created recurring revenue. A shop owner paying 5 shillings per week generated a steady income stream that could be projected. It managed. The gang could scale operations by expanding territory or recruiting more businesses. And the costs were minimal, occasional displays of violence to maintain credibility, but most businesses paid willingly to avoid trouble. The Peaky Blinders filled a genuine vacuum in Birmingham's post-war landscape. They emerged because conditions allowed them to emerge, because opportunities existed, and because men returned from war with the skills, psychology, and motivation to exploit those opportunities without moral hesitation. They were not aberrations or anomalies. They were rational actors responding to incentives in an environment where legitimate authority had collapsed. Their formation represents something both fascinating and troubling about human organization. When formal systems fail, informal systems emerge to replace them. When government cannot or will not maintain order, private actors will create their own forms of order. The Peaky Blinders built something that functioned, an organization that solved real problems for its stakeholders, that operated according to rules, that maintained internal coherence. That it was built on violence and coercion does not change the strategic logic. Throughout history, many successful organizations began this way. The question is not whether the Peaky Blinders were justified; they were criminals, and their violence caused real suffering. The question is why they succeeded when they did, how they built what they built, and what their rise reveals about the conditions that allow organized crime to flourish. Birmingham in 1918 and 1919 provided those conditions in abundance. A city full of trained killers with no jobs, police too weak to maintain order, industries awash with cash but light on regulation, political attention directed elsewhere. This was not a recipe for peace. This was a recipe for exactly what emerged. Organized criminal enterprise that would dominate Birmingham's underworld. For the better part of a decade, the Peaky Blinders were coming, and Birmingham, whether it knew it or not, was ready for them. There is a moment in the life of any organization, legitimate or otherwise, when it transitions from opportunistic action to systematic operation, when ad hoc responses crystallize into repeatable processes, when individual actors become coordinated units. This transformation separates movements that flame briefly and die from enterprises that endure and expand. The Peaky Blinders made this transition with remarkable efficiency, and understanding how they did so reveals something profound about organizational design under hostile conditions. Begin with the territory itself. Small Heath, in the eastern reaches of Birmingham, was not chosen randomly as the gang's base of operations. Study the geography, and you see immediately why it offered strategic advantage. Dense rows of terraced housing created a labyrinth where outsiders got lost, but locals knew every alley, every shortcut, every escape route. The neighborhood's working-class residents, many Irish immigrants, harbored deep suspicion of police authority. Poverty made people willing to look the other way for small payments or favors. Multiple main roads passed through, providing quick access to the city center and neighboring districts. The railway goods yards offered opportunities for theft and smuggling. Pubs clustered thickly, serving as both revenue sources and communication networks. Thomas Gilbert, one of the gang's early prominent figures, understood territorial control in ways that would have impressed a military strategist. He had served in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, survived campaigns that killed half his company, and returned to Birmingham with tactical knowledge that translated surprisingly well to urban criminal operations. Control territory, and you control everything that happens within it. Allow your territory to be contested, and you control nothing. The Peaky Blinders began by establishing absolute dominance in Small Heath. Every pub, every betting shop, every business of any size paid tribute. But more importantly, they created what military organizations call situational awareness. They knew everything that happened in their territory. New faces were noticed immediately. Police patrols were tracked and their patterns noted. Rival gang members who entered Small Heath were identified and dealt with before they could establish any presence. This required organization beyond simple thuggery. The gang developed a cell structure with different groups responsible for different functions. Some members specialized in collecting protection payments, showing up at businesses weekly with ledgers that tracked who paid and who owed. Others focused on the racecourses, managing the bookmaker protection operations that generated the largest revenues. Still others handled enforcement, delivering beatings to those who refused payment, making examples that would discourage others from resistance. Ernest Bales emerged as particularly effective at enforcement. His reputation for calculated brutality served a strategic purpose. In organized crime, reputation often eliminates the need for actual violence. If everyone knows that crossing Ernest Bales results in a beating so severe you might never work again, most people simply comply. The violence becomes almost theoretical, a threat that maintains order through fear rather than constant application. This is efficient. Actual violence costs time, risks police attention, and occasionally results in retaliation. The threat of violence, credibly maintained, achieves the same results with far lower costs. But here is what separated the Peaky Blinders from common street criminals. They understood that fear alone creates fragile control. People ruled only by terror will rebel the moment they sense weakness. Sustainable criminal organizations require something more sophisticated. They require consent, or at least acquiescence, from the community they operate within. The gang achieved this through a strategy as old as organized crime itself. Selective generosity combined with collective punishment. They became providers as well as predators. A widow struggling to pay rent might find an envelope of cash slipped under her door, no questions asked. A family facing eviction might discover their landlord suddenly willing to extend credit after a quiet conversation with gang representatives. Children in Small Heath received gifts at Christmas. Local pubs saw their protection payments subsidize drinks for regulars. The unemployed found occasional work running errands or delivering messages. This created a complex relationship between the gang and the community. Yes, businesses paid protection money under threat of violence, but that money flowed back into the community in ways that generated genuine gratitude. The Peaky Blinders positioned themselves not as external parasites, but as part of Small Heath's social fabric, harsh and violent, certainly, but also protective and occasionally generous. Residents might not love them, but they defended them against outside interference, particularly police interference. Consider what this meant for law enforcement. A constable investigating a crime in Small Heath found himself facing walls of silence. Witnesses saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. Even victims often refused to press charges, claiming the assault was a misunderstanding or that they had no idea who attacked them. The few residents willing to cooperate with police faced social ostracism at best, violent retaliation at worst. The gang had effectively made their territory ungovernable through conventional policing methods. This territorial dominance provided the foundation for expansion. From Small Heath, the Peaky Blinders moved methodically into adjacent districts: Bordersley, Derritend, Sparkbrook. They did not simply appear in new territories and demand submission. They studied each district first, identifying key businesses, understanding local power structures, finding residents willing to provide information. When they moved decisively, overwhelming any local resistance before it could organize. Harry Fowles led many of these expansion operations. His approach combined intelligence gathering with sudden, overwhelming force. The gang would spend weeks learning everything about a new territory, which pub owners might resist, which businesses generated the most revenue, which residents commanded respect. Then they would strike all at once, demonstrating their presence through coordinated actions across the entire district. Protection payments would be demanded from every business simultaneously. Any resistance would be crushed immediately and publicly. Within days, the new territory would be under control, and the gang would already be consolidating, recruiting local members who knew the area intimately. This expansion strategy reveals sophisticated organizational thinking. The Peaky Blinders understood that growth creates vulnerability if not properly managed. Expand too quickly, and you overextend your resources, leaving territories poorly controlled and vulnerable to counterattack. Expand too slowly, and rivals fill the vacuum, forcing costly conflicts later. The gang found a balanced, methodical expansion that allowed proper integration of each new territory before moving to the next. But territorial control alone does not build criminal empire. The Peaky Blinders needed to convert geographic dominance into sustained revenue, and this required business sophistication that went far beyond simple extortion. Their bookmaking operations illustrate this sophistication. Initially, the gang simply protected independent bookmakers at racecourses, taking a percentage of revenue. But they quickly recognized they could generate far more profit by operating their own betting operations. This required capital to cover potential losses, mathematical skills to set odds that ensured profitability, and organizational ability to manage multiple betting pitches simultaneously. The gang recruited men with accounting experience, often former clerks made redundant after the war. These men brought skills. The street fighters lacked the ability to track money flows, calculate probabilities, identify which betting pitches generated the most revenue. The Peaky Blinders evolved from simple protection racketeers into integrated gambling operators, controlling the entire value chain from setting odds to collecting debts. At racecourses throughout the Midlands, the gang's betting operations dominated. They claimed the best pitches through intimidation, driving out competitors or forcing them into partnerships on unfavorable terms. They coordinated odds across multiple bookmakers to minimize risk, ensuring that no matter how punters bet, the gang's overall book remained profitable. They employed spotters to identify heavy bettors and track their patterns. They used violence not randomly, but strategically, making examples of those who tried to cheat or welch on debts, maintaining the system's integrity through calculated cruelty. The revenues were extraordinary. On a busy race day, the gang might clear £500 in profit, more than most Birmingham workers earned in several years. Multiply this across multiple race meetings each week during the season, and the gang's core betting operations generated thousands of pounds monthly. This capital funded everything else: expansion into new territories, payments to corrupt officials, investments in smuggling operations, and most importantly, the ability to weather setbacks that would destroy less capitalized organizations. Smuggling operations required different skills but followed similar organizational principles. The gang identified weak points in the supply chain docks in Liverpool where customs inspectors could be bribed, rail routes where shipments went unmonitored, warehouses in Birmingham where illegal goods could be stored. They established relationships with Irish suppliers who could provide untaxed whiskey, with French contacts who smuggled brandy, with industrial facilities willing to divert alcohol meant for manufacturing. The logistics were complex. Shipments needed to be coordinated across multiple parties, with each link in the chain knowing only what they needed to know. Money flowed backwards through the same channels, with the gang taking its percentage at each stage. Distribution to pubs and illegal drinking establishments required careful management to avoid police detection. Yet the Peaky Blinders managed these operations efficiently, demonstrating organizational capabilities that rivaled legitimate businesses. Corruption provided the lubricant that made all this possible. The gang cultivated relationships with police officers at multiple levels. Beat constables received regular payments to ignore gang activities in their districts. Sergeants provided advance warning of raids or investigations. Detectives ensured that cases against gang members fell apart due to missing evidence or witness intimidation. The gang paid well and consistently, making corruption a reliable income stream for officials whose legitimate salaries barely covered living expenses. But they also understood that purely financial relationships were fragile. The gang therefore collected compromising information on corrupt officials, evidence of their bribe-taking, photographs of them at gang-run brothels, documentation of their own petty crimes. This created a web of mutual compromise. Officials could not betray the gang without exposing themselves. The relationship became symbiotic rather than simply transactional. Political connections required even more delicate management. Local councillors and members of parliament could not be seen openly associating with criminals, yet their campaigns required funding and their political machines needed workers to get out the vote. The Peaky Blinders provided both. Campaign contributions flowed through legitimate businesses the gang controlled. On election days, gang members ensured favourable turnout in working-class districts through methods both legal and otherwise. In return, politicians ensured that police budgets remained constrained, that investigations into gang activities received low priority, that licenses for pubs and businesses the gang owned were approved without difficult questions. This created a remarkable situation. The Peaky Blinders operated with a degree of political protection that made conventional law enforcement largely ineffective. Police who tried too aggressively to combat the gang found themselves reassigned or investigated for corruption. Prosecutors discovered that witnesses became unavailable, that evidence disappeared, that juries inexplicably acquitted despite overwhelming proof of guilt. The gang had not simply corrupted individuals, they had corrupted the system itself. Leadership structure within the gang evolved to manage this growing complexity. Early on, the Peaky Blinders operated as a loose confederation of street gangs with shifting alliances. But successful criminal enterprise requires hierarchy, clear decision-making authority, and mechanisms for resolving internal disputes without destructive violence. A core leadership group emerged, comprising the most effective operators and the most feared enforcers. Thomas Gilbert's tactical intelligence made him invaluable for planning operations. Ernest Bales's reputation for violence gave the leadership credible enforcement capability. Harry Fowles's success in territorial expansion earned him authority over those operations. Others specialized in maintaining political and police connections, managing the bookmaking operations, or handling the increasingly complex financial arrangements. This leadership operated through consensus on major decisions but maintained clear authority over their respective domains. Gilbert could plan an operation without consulting others, but moving into a new territory required collective agreement. Bales handled enforcement without oversight, but killing someone the ultimate sanction needed leadership approval. This balance prevented the chaos of too much democracy, while avoiding the fragility of autocracy where everything depends on a single leader. The gang also developed sophisticated communication systems. In an era before telephones were common, they used a network of messengers, coded signals, and trusted intermediaries. Pubs served as message drops. Certain shops acted as neutral meeting grounds. The gang created its own language, slang terms for money, for police, for violence that allowed members to communicate openly without outsiders understanding. Internal discipline required constant attention. Criminal organizations face unique challenges. Members cannot appeal to courts or authorities if they feel wronged, creating risks of violent internal disputes. The Peaky Blinders developed informal courts where grievances could be heard and adjudicated. Members who felt cheated or disrespected could present their case to leadership, which would render judgment. This did not always prevent violence, but it channeled disputes into processes that preserved organizational cohesion. Recruitment became increasingly systematic. The gang sought men with specific skills, former soldiers for enforcement, former bookmakers for gambling operations, men with family connections to police or politicians for corruption networks. They recruited young boys as lookouts and message runners, training the next generation. They identified women who could serve as couriers, assuming correctly that police would scrutinize them less carefully than men. This systematic recruitment addressed a fundamental challenge. As the organization grew, it needed to absorb new members without diluting the trust and cohesion that made it effective. The gang developed initiation processes that tested loyalty, assigned new members to work under experienced supervision, and gradually granted authority as competence was proven. Not everyone could join. Membership became valuable precisely because it was selective. The Peaky Blinders at their organizational peak represented something remarkable, a criminal enterprise that functioned as efficiently as many legitimate businesses. They had clear revenue streams, systematic expansion strategies, sophisticated financial management, corruption networks that protected operations, leadership structures that enabled coordinated action, and recruitment processes that maintained organizational quality. They had built an empire, not through accident or simple brutality, but through calculated strategy, organizational discipline, and ruthless efficiency. They had transformed from street gang to criminal corporation, from opportunistic thugs to strategic operators controlling significant portions of Birmingham's underworld economy. But empires, as history teaches us repeatedly, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The very success that made the Peaky Blinders dominant would attract attention, competition, and eventually forces that would prove more powerful than they could overcome. For now, though, they stood at the peak of their power, masters of territory and trade, feared and respected in equal measure. The question was not whether they could build an empire. They had proven that already. The question was whether they could hold it. There exists in the life cycle of every organization a moment of perfect balance when growth has been achieved, but overextension has not yet begun, when systems function smoothly but complacency has not set in, when power is maximized, but the forces that will eventually destroy it have not yet gathered sufficient strength. For the Peaky Blinders, this moment arrived in the early 1920s, when they operated at peak efficiency across multiple criminal enterprises, when their territorial control seemed unshakable, when profits flowed with such abundance that the gang's leadership could scarcely have imagined their circumstances just a few years earlier. Imagine standing at the edge of a Birmingham racecourse on a Saturday afternoon in 1922. The crowd surges around you, thousands of men in cloth caps and worn suits, their week's wages folded into pockets, hope and desperation mingled in equal measure. The air smells of tobacco smoke, horse sweat, and fried food from the vendors lining the rails. And there, commanding the prime positions near the finish line, stand the Peaky Blinders bookmakers. You recognize them immediately, even if you have never seen them before. They operate with a confidence that borders on arrogance. Their stands are larger, better positioned, more professionally maintained than those of independent bookmakers relegated to the margins. Their chalkboards display odds that somehow always seem more attractive than the competition. Men cluster around them 3 and 4 deep, shoving money forward, receiving tickets that represent either fortune or loss. Watch closely, and you see the system in operation. Each bookmaker has at least 2 assistants, one managing the money, another recording bets. Spotters move through the crowd, identifying heavy bettors, watching for suspicious patterns that might indicate a fix. Enforcers stand nearby, not obviously threatening but unmistakably present. Their role is not to intimidate customers, but to protect the operation, ensuring no one tries to rob the bookmaker, that no rival attempts to interfere, that the day's substantial cash accumulation makes it safely back to headquarters. The mathematics underlying these operations would impress any legitimate business analyst. The Peaky Blinders had mastered the fundamental principle of bookmaking. The house always wins if you manage risk properly. Their bookmakers coordinated odds across multiple pitches, ensuring that no matter how money flowed across different horses, the aggregate book remained profitable. They employed what would later be called hedging strategies, placing their own bets with other bookmakers to offset exposures on specific horses where too much money had accumulated on one side. This required sophisticated information management. Runners moved constantly between betting pitches, carrying updates on how much had been wagered on which horses, allowing real-time odds adjustments. The gang maintained records of regular bettors, tracking their patterns and preferences. They cultivated relationships with stable hands and jockeys, not to fix races that was too risky and too visible, but to gain insights into which horses were truly fit and which were being raced despite injuries or poor training. On a typical race day during this peak period, the Peaky Blinders might operate 10 betting pitches across multiple racecourses within reach of Birmingham. Each pitch might handle £300 to £500 in bets across a day's card of 6 or 7 races. After paying out winnings and covering operational costs, each pitch generated roughly £100 in profit. Across all operations, a single Saturday could net the gang £1,000, the equivalent of what a skilled industrial worker might earn in 3 years. Multiply this across the racing season, and the scale becomes extraordinary. The gang's bookmaking operations generated annual revenues in the tens of thousands of pounds, with profit margins that legitimate businesses could only envy. This wealth transformed them from street criminals into something approaching organized business enterprise. But the racecourses represented only one revenue stream, albeit the most visible and lucrative: return. With me to Birmingham itself, to the streets of Small Heath, and the expanding territories under gang control. Here operated another tier of the empire, the protection rackets that generated steady, predictable income, regardless of racing schedules or seasonal variations. By 1922, virtually every business in the gang's territory paid regular tribute. The amounts varied based on the business's size and profitability. A small shop selling cigarettes and newspapers might pay 5 shillings weekly. A pub with steady custom paid £2 to £3. Larger establishments, music halls, warehouses, manufacturing facilities paid substantially more. The gang had effectively created a parallel taxation system, extracting wealth from every economic activity within their domain. The genius of this system lay in its psychological structure. Payments were framed not as extortion but as insurance. You paid for protection from rival gangs, from thieves, from the chaos that prevailed in territories where no one maintained order. And remarkably, the gang actually provided this protection. A shop owner under their control who reported a theft would see the gang investigate with more efficiency and brutality than police ever managed. Stolen goods often reappeared. Thieves received beatings that discouraged future attempts. This created a perverse but genuine value proposition. Yes, business owners paid money they would prefer to keep, but they received something tangible in return: a reduction in other criminal losses, confidence that contracts would be enforced, knowledge that disputes with customers or suppliers could be resolved through gang mediation. The Peaky Blinders had become, in effect, a privatized judicial and security system operating in parallel to the legitimate one. Consider the economics from a pub owner's perspective. You pay the gang £3 weekly. Without their protection, you might lose £5 to theft, suffer £10 in damage during fights, lose customers because the pub feels unsafe, and waste hours dealing with police who achieve nothing. The £3 starts to seem like a reasonable business expense. You still resent it, certainly, but you pay willingly rather than under direct threat. The gang understood this psychology deeply. They avoided the trap of simply squeezing maximum payments from every business. That would create resentment and resistance, making the system fragile. Instead, They calibrated payments to remain bearable enough to generate substantial aggregate revenue, but not so much that businesses failed or owners fled. They wanted sustainable extraction, not predatory destruction. This principle extended to their smuggling operations, which by the early 20s had evolved into sophisticated supply chain management. The gang had established reliable connections with suppliers in Ireland, Scotland, and the continent. They knew which customs officials at which ports could be bribed, which rail routes avoided excessive scrutiny, which warehouses in Birmingham could store contraband safely. The alcohol they smuggled, primarily Irish whiskey and Scottish spirits, along with some French brandy, flowed through a distribution network comprising dozens of pubs, illegal drinking establishments, and private clubs. The gang supplied these outlets at prices below taxed legal alcohol, but well above their acquisition costs. A barrel of Irish whiskey might cost them £5 delivered to Birmingham. They sold it to publicans for £12. The publicans then served it at normal prices, pocketing the difference between what they paid and what legal alcohol would have cost. Everyone profited except the government, which lost tax revenue. The scale of these operations was substantial. The gang might move 50 barrels weekly during peak periods, generating £350 in profit per week from alcohol alone. Annually, this represented another major revenue stream, less lucrative than bookmaking but more stable and less seasonal. Money laundering became necessary as wealth accumulated. You cannot simply deposit thousands of pounds in cash at a bank without attracting attention. The gang needed to convert illegal profits into legitimate assets, and they did so through a series of increasingly sophisticated methods. They purchased legitimate businesses, pubs, betting shops, after these became legal, small manufacturing concerns, properties for rental income. These businesses were operated legitimately, paying taxes and maintaining proper records, but they also served to explain the gang's visible wealth. A pub that the gang controlled might report higher revenues than it actually generated, creating a paper trail that justified deposits of money actually earned through illegal activities elsewhere. They cultivated relationships with accountants and solicitors willing to create complex corporate structures. Money would flow through multiple businesses and jurisdictions, becoming progressively more difficult to trace. The gang learned to exploit the gaps in financial regulation, the limited information sharing between institutions, the difficulty authorities faced in tracking cash movements across multiple entities. Some gang leaders invested in property, purchasing houses and commercial buildings that appreciated in value while providing legitimate rental income. Others bought into legitimate businesses as silent partners, their capital welcomed even if its origins were suspect. The most sophisticated invested in financial instruments, bonds, shares in companies diversifying their holdings and integrating themselves into Birmingham's commercial establishment. This financial sophistication marked a crucial evolution. The Peaky Blinders were no longer simply criminals extracting wealth from their territories. They were becoming, in part, legitimate businessmen with diversified portfolios. This transition created new opportunities, but also new vulnerabilities, as their increasing integration into legitimate commerce exposed them to regulatory scrutiny they had previously avoided. The gang's relationship with law enforcement during this peak period represented a masterpiece of corruption management. They had moved beyond simply bribing individual officers to creating a comprehensive system that neutralized police effectiveness across multiple levels. At the street level, beat constables received regular payments, typically £1 to £2 weekly, in exchange for ignoring gang activities, providing advance warning of raids, and ensuring their reports never contained information useful to investigators. These payments represented substantial supplements to official salaries, and most officers rationalized accepting them easily enough. They were not actively helping criminals, they told themselves, simply declining to be heroic about preventing crimes that would happen regardless. Sergeants and inspectors required more careful handling. They commanded resources and coordinated operations, making their cooperation more valuable but also more risky to solicit. The gang approached them gradually, starting with small favors and payments, escalating only when confidence had been established. By the peak period, multiple senior officers were providing the gang with detailed information about police operations, which investigations were active, who was being surveilled, when raids were planned. Detectives posed particular challenges and opportunities. A corrupt detective could undermine investigations from within, ensuring evidence was mishandled, witnesses intimidated, cases built poorly. But detectives also faced more scrutiny from superiors, and more risk if their corruption was exposed. The gang paid them substantially more, sometimes £10 to £20, for specific acts of sabotage, and also cultivated personal relationships that made betrayal feel like breaking trust with friends, rather than simply abandoning criminal associates. Political protection during this period reached its zenith. Multiple Birmingham city councillors received regular campaign contributions from businesses the gang controlled. They understood where the money originated, but maintained plausible deniability. In return, they ensured that police budgets remained constrained, that investigations into organised crime received low priority, and that regulations potentially harmful to gang operations were never seriously pursued. Even more valuable were connections to members of Parliament and Home Office officials. These relationships required delicate management. Such figures could not be seen associating with criminals, but they could be influenced through intermediaries. A businessman known to be close to the gang might arrange a meeting where concerns about excessive police activism could be expressed. A solicitor might submit a carefully worded memorandum about the costs of aggressive anti-gang operations. Political pressure flowed downward through the system, constraining what local police could accomplish even when they wanted to act. The result was remarkable. The Peaky Blinders operated with near impunity in their core territories. Arrests occurred occasionally, maintaining appearances, but prosecutions collapsed with predictable regularity. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. Evidence went missing. Juries acquitted despite seemingly conclusive proof. The few gang members who did serve prison time found their sentences shortened through parole boards mysteriously sympathetic to their cases. But maintaining this empire required constant attention to internal cohesion. Criminal organizations face unique challenges. Members cannot resort to courts when disputes arise, creating risks of violence that can destroy the organization from within. The Peaky Blinders had developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing these tensions. They maintained a system of internal justice where grievances could be heard and adjudicated. A member who felt cheated in the division of profits, or disrespected by a superior, or unfairly punished, could appeal to leadership. These appeals were taken seriously because leadership understood that unresolved resentments festered and eventually exploded. Justice might not always be perfectly fair, but it was rendered consistently and visibly, creating confidence that the system functioned according to rules rather than arbitrary power. The gang also developed clear advancement pathways. Young members who proved competent and loyal could rise to positions of greater authority and larger shares of profits. This created incentives for good performance and loyalty, while providing ambitious members with alternatives to breaking away and forming rival organizations. The system was neither democratic nor perfectly meritocratic, but it was rational enough to maintain cohesion. Profit distribution followed carefully calibrated formulas. Leadership took the largest shares, justified by their planning and risk-taking. Specialists, the accountants, the corrupt police contacts, the key enforcers received substantial payments reflecting their value. Regular members earned steady incomes well above legitimate employment alternatives. Even the lowest-ranking participants received enough to make membership worthwhile. This distribution structure created buy-in throughout the organization. Everyone benefited from the gang's success, giving everyone reason to maintain operational security and resist temptations to cooperate with police. The alternative to gang membership was poverty. Even junior members lived substantially better than they could through legitimate means. By the early 1920s, the Peaky Blinders had achieved something extraordinary. They had built a criminal enterprise that functioned with the efficiency of a corporation, that generated profits rivaling legitimate businesses, that commanded loyalty through both fear and genuine benefit, that had so thoroughly corrupted the systems meant to suppress it that they operated with practical immunity from consequences. They controlled territory stretching across much of eastern Birmingham. They dominated gambling at racecourses throughout the Midlands. They operated smuggling networks spanning multiple countries. They had integrated into legitimate commerce through property ownership and business investments. They had accumulated wealth that transformed gang leaders from slum dwellers into men of substantial means, living in comfortable homes, wearing fine clothes, commanding respect that extended far beyond their original neighborhoods. This was their peak, the moment of maximum power, maximum profit, maximum control. They stood atop a criminal empire that seemed unshakable, built on violence and corruption, but also on genuine organizational sophistication and strategic intelligence. But empires at their peak contain within them the seeds of decline. The very success that made the Peaky Blinders dominant was creating the conditions that would eventually destroy them. Their visibility attracted attention, their wealth attracted competitors, their expansion created vulnerabilities, and the world around them was changing in ways they did not yet fully appreciate. Forces were gathering that would prove more powerful than their violence, more sophisticated than their organization, more relentless than their ambition. The peak had been reached, and from peaks there is only one direction to travel. Success breeds a particular kind of blindness. When strategies have worked repeatedly, when obstacles have been overcome, when power has grown steadily, organizations begin to believe in their own invincibility. They mistake temporary advantages for permanent superiority. They assume that methods which succeeded in one context will succeed in all contexts. They fail to notice when the fundamental conditions that enabled their success are changing. The Peaky Blinders, at the height of their power, began making the classic errors of dominant organizations facing new challenges they do not fully comprehend. The first miscalculation was territorial. Success in Birmingham created hunger for expansion beyond the city's boundaries. This seemed logical. If the gang could dominate one city, why not expand into neighboring territories where similar opportunities existed? The profits from new territories would multiply their wealth. Their reputation would spread. They would become not merely a Birmingham phenomenon, but a regional power. In 1923, the gang moved aggressively into Coventry, a city 20 miles to the southeast. The operation began with their standard approach: intelligence gathering, identification of key businesses and criminal actors, then sudden, overwhelming assertion of control. They announced their presence through coordinated violence, demanding protection payments from businesses, claiming betting pitches at the local racecourse, making it clear that Coventry now operated under new management. But Coventry was not Small Heath. The local criminal networks, while less sophisticated than the Peaky Blinders, were embedded in their territory with deep roots. They knew every street, every ally, every place to hide. More importantly, they were defending their home ground rather than invading someone else's. The psychology of defense differs profoundly from the psychology of conquest. Defenders fight with desperation and local knowledge that invaders cannot match. The Peaky Blinders found themselves in a grinding conflict that consumed resources without generating the quick dominance they expected. Ambushes occurred in unfamiliar streets. Local police, not yet corrupted or intimidated, arrested gang members who lacked the political protection they enjoyed in Birmingham. Businesses proved more resistant, knowing they could appeal to local authorities who still functioned with some independence. What should have been a swift conquest became a costly occupation. Worse, Maintaining control in Coventry required permanent presence gang members stationed there who were not generating revenue in Birmingham. Constant travel back and forth consuming time and money, leadership attention diverted from core operations. The gang was learning a lesson that empires throughout history have learned painfully. Expansion is easy, but holding territory requires resources that grow exponentially with distance from the power base. They made similar moves into other surrounding towns: Wolverhampton, Walsall, smaller communities in the Black Country. Each expansion followed the same pattern: initial success, then stubborn resistance, then resource drain managing territories that generated less profit than anticipated. The gang was overextending, stretching its organizational capacity beyond optimal limits, creating vulnerabilities that more focused opponents could exploit. But the most serious strategic threat emerged not from their own overreach, but from the rise of more sophisticated criminal competition. In London, a gang led by a man named Charles Sabini had been watching the Peaky Blinders' success with great interest. Sabini understood something fundamental. The Peaky Blinders had demonstrated that racecourse control generated extraordinary profits, but they had not yet expanded their operations to the southern racecourses, where the real money flowed. The southern racing circuit, tracks like Epsom, Ascot, Brighton, served a wealthier clientele and handled volumes of betting that made Birmingham operations look modest by comparison. Sabini had established control over these tracks through methods similar to the Peaky Blinders: violence, intimidation, protection rackets. But he had done so with greater sophistication, better political connections, and more substantial capital backing. The inevitable conflict began in 1924, when the Peaky Blinders attempted to extend their operations to southern tracks. They arrived expecting their reputation to precede them, that their Birmingham dominance would translate automatically to respect and submission elsewhere. Instead, they encountered the Sabini gang, which was larger, better connected to London's political establishment, and operating on its home ground. The first confrontations were relatively minor bookmakers, loyal to each side being intimidated, threats exchanged, a few beatings delivered to establish presence. But these skirmishes escalated rapidly. At a race meeting at Alexandra Park in North London, open warfare erupted. Dozens of men from both gangs confronted each other with razors, clubs, and improvised weapons. The violence was so extreme that even police accustomed to turning a blind eye had to intervene. Multiple arrests followed, but more significantly, the Peaky Blinders discovered they were not the most dangerous gang in England. The conflict with the Sabinis exposed critical weaknesses in the Peaky Blinders' strategic position. Their power derived largely from territorial control and local political protection. Outside Birmingham, both advantages evaporated. Sabini had superior connections to the Metropolitan Police and London politicians. His gang could mobilize more men, had better intelligence about racing industry operations, and benefited from proximity to the tracks they controlled. The Peaky Blinders fought fiercely, but they were fighting on unfavourable ground. Every operation in London required travel from Birmingham, coordination across distances that made communication difficult, and conflict in territory where they had no local support base. They won some battles through sheer ferocity, but they were losing the war strategically. The costs of maintaining operations in London exceeded the revenues generated. Worse, the conflict distracted leadership attention from Birmingham, where their core businesses required constant management. Here was a crucial decision point. The gang could have recognized that southern expansion was not viable, consolidated their Birmingham dominance, and avoided a costly conflict they could not win. Instead, pride and ambition drove continued escalation. They had never backed down from a fight. Retreat seemed like weakness, so they continued pouring resources into a conflict that was undermining their entire strategic position. Meanwhile, back in Birmingham, a different kind of threat was emerging, the law enforcement finally beginning to adapt. For years, the police had been consistently outmaneuvered by the Peaky Blinders. Traditional policing methods failed against an organization that had corrupted many officers, intimidated witnesses, and operated through cells that limited exposure when members were arrested. But by the mid-1920s, some police officials were developing new approaches. A detective inspector named Robert Farnsworth arrived in Birmingham in 1925 with experience fighting organised crime in Liverpool. He understood that traditional reactive policing responding to crimes after they occurred would never defeat sophisticated criminal organisations. Instead, he advocated for intelligence-led operations, sustained surveillance, informant cultivation, financial investigation, and coordinated strikes designed to disrupt the gang's business operations rather than simply arresting individual members. Farnsworth began building a specialist unit focused exclusively on organised crime. He recruited officers from outside Birmingham who had no connections to local corruption networks. He developed new surveillance techniques, including photographic documentation of gang activities and systematic mapping of their operations. Most importantly, he began targeting the gang's financial operations rather than just their violence. This represented a strategic shift that the Peaky Blinders were slow to recognize. They had optimized their operations to defeat traditional policing, cells that prevented comprehensive arrests, witness intimidation that prevented prosecutions, political protection that limited police resources. But Farnsworth's approach bypassed many of these defenses. Financial investigations did not require witness testimony. They relied on documents, records, and patterns that could be demonstrated objectively. Surveillance produced photographic evidence that could not be intimidated into silence. The gang's response to this new threat was dangerously inadequate. They continued using methods that had worked before identifying and intimidating police officers, pressuring political allies to constrain investigations, relying on their corruption networks to sabotage cases from within. These methods still work to some degree, but less effectively than before. Farnsworth had specifically designed his unit to be resistant to the traditional corruption approaches. More fundamentally, the gang failed to appreciate that the nature of their threat environment had changed. When police had been weak, disorganized, and easily corrupted, the gang's advantages were overwhelming. But as law enforcement became more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more strategically focused, those advantages eroded. The Peaky Blinders were fighting the last war, using tactics optimized for conditions that no longer fully applied. Internal tensions were also building, though leadership failed to address them adequately. Success had made the gang wealthy, but it had also created resentment about how wealth was distributed. Younger members, seeing older leadership living in relative comfort while they continued risking arrest and violence, began questioning whether the system remained fair. Some suspected correctly that leaders were skimming more than their agreed share of profits. Disputes that once would have been resolved through the gang's internal justice system now festered. A member named William "Billy" Davies, who had been instrumental in the Coventry expansion, felt he deserved a larger share of the profits his operations generated. When leadership denied his demands, he began operating semi-independently, keeping portions of revenue that should have been remitted to central leadership. This was not quite betrayal, but it was the beginning of organizational fragmentation. Leadership responded with traditional methods, violence, and intimidation to reassert control. Billy Davies was beaten severely as an example to others who might consider similar rebellion, but this created new problems. Davies had supporters, men loyal to him personally who resented his treatment. The beating prevented open rebellion, but did nothing to address the underlying grievances. The gang was holding together through fear rather than genuine loyalty, always a fragile arrangement. The conflict with the Sabinis was also creating strain. Men were being injured or arrested in London operations that generated little profit. Some began questioning whether the southern expansion was worth the cost. Murmurs of discontent spread through the ranks, quiet conversations in pubs, complaints shared among trusted associates. Leadership knew about this discontent, but treated it as a discipline problem to be suppressed rather than a strategic signal that their approach needed reconsideration. Perhaps most dangerously, the gang was failing to recognize broader economic and social changes that were undermining their business model. The betting industry that had been their primary revenue source was beginning to evolve. The 1920s saw growing calls for regulation and legalization of gambling. Reformers argued that since people were going to gamble regardless, the trade should be brought above ground where it could be taxed and regulated rather than controlled by. This movement gained momentum slowly but steadily. Pilot programs in licensing bookmakers began in some jurisdictions. Parliamentary committees investigated gambling reform. The economic logic was compelling. Legal betting could generate tax revenue for cash-strapped governments while eliminating the criminal element that breeding violence and corruption. For the Peaky Blinders, legalization represented an existential threat. Their competitive advantage derived from operating illegally. If bookmaking became legal, legitimate operators with better capital and political connections would enter the market, driving them out through competition rather than force. The gang seemed not to recognize this threat's severity. They continued optimizing operations for the current environment, rather than preparing for a future that looked fundamentally different. They made no serious attempts to transition into legitimate gambling operations, to build the skills and relationships that would be necessary in a regulated market, or to diversify their revenue streams beyond gambling-dependent activities. There was also a generational transition problem brewing. The original leadership men, like Thomas Gilbert, Ernest Bales, Harry Fowles, were aging. They had built the organization through direct experience, learning hard lessons about what worked and what failed, but they had not developed a clear succession plan. Younger members had ambition but lacked the strategic sophistication that came from building the organization from nothing. When the original leaders eventually stepped back or were arrested, who would replace them? And would those replacements command the same respect and possess the same capabilities? The gang held leadership meetings where these issues were discussed, but only superficially. No one wanted to confront the uncomfortable reality that their dominance might be temporary, that the conditions enabling their success were changing, that strategic adaptation was necessary. They had succeeded through aggression, violence, and intimidation. Suggesting that these methods might no longer be sufficient seemed like weakness, like lack of commitment to the principles that had built their power. This represented a classic strategic trap organizations so committed to the methods that brought them success that they cannot adapt when circumstances change. The Peaky Blinders had optimized themselves perfectly for the environment of 1918 to 1924. Weak police, unregulated gambling, post-war chaos. But by the mid-1920s, that environment was evolving. Police were strengthening and adopting new methods. Gambling was moving toward regulation. The economy was stabilizing. Political attention was refocusing on domestic crime. In each case, the gang's response was to do more of what had worked before, but more intensively. They used more violence, corrupted more officials, expanded more aggressively. They mistook tactical excellence for strategic wisdom, failing to recognize that excellent execution of a flawed strategy only delays defeat, it does not prevent it. There were members who saw these problems clearly, men who understood that the southern expansion was overextension, that the Sabini conflict was unwinnable, that changing economic conditions required adaptation. But these voices found limited audience. Leadership had developed psychological investment in their own dominance. Admitting strategic error felt like admitting weakness. So they doubled down on failing approaches, hoping that sufficient determination would overcome structural disadvantages. The 1925 race season saw the conflict with the Sabinis reach its peak intensity. Multiple violent confrontations occurred at southern tracks. The Peaky Blinders committed substantial resources to establishing presence at Epsom and Ascot. the most prestigious tracks. They achieved some tactical successes. Bookmakers paid them for protection. Rival gang members were beaten or driven off, but they were winning battles while losing the war. The costs were enormous. Dozens of gang members arrested, many serving prison sentences. Legal fees consumed substantial capital. Operations in Birmingham suffered from diverted attention and resources. Profits declined, even as expenses mounted. And all this occurred while the Sabinis, operating on home ground with superior political protection, actually strengthened their position. By late 1925, the Peaky Blinders faced a strategic situation far more precarious than most members realized. They had overextended territorially, engaging in costly operations in Coventry, Wolverhampton, and London that drained resources without generating proportionate returns. They faced a more sophisticated enemy in the Sabinis, who had superior resources and political connections. They confronted increasingly effective police operations led by officers who understood how to combat organized crime. They were experiencing internal tensions over profit distribution and succession, and they were failing to prepare for regulatory changes that would undermine their core business model. Each of these problems was manageable individually. Together, they represented converging threats that would require strategic brilliance to overcome. Instead, the gang's leadership responded with tactical stubbornness, continuing to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, refusing to consolidate or retreat, believing that the methods that had built their empire would sustain it indefinitely. They were wrong. The peak had passed. The decline was beginning, though it would take several more years to become undeniable. Strategic miscalculations made during the period of maximum power were creating vulnerabilities that enemies both criminal and legal would soon exploit with devastating effectiveness. The empire was cracking. The question now was not whether it would fall, but how quickly, and whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. There is a particular cruelty in economic collapse. It arrives not as dramatic catastrophe, but as gradual erosion, revenue declining by 5%, then 10%, then 20%, each drop seeming manageable until you realize the cumulative effect has destroyed your entire business model. Organizations can survive strategic defeats, leadership failures, even violent conflicts, but they rarely survive the quiet mathematics of revenues falling below costs, of markets disappearing, of the fundamental economic logic that sustained them simply ceasing to function. For the Peaky Blinders, the Great Depression delivered exactly this kind of killing blow, amplified by regulatory changes and competitive pressures that converged with devastating precision. Begin with October 1929, when financial markets in New York collapsed and sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The immediate effects on Birmingham were not catastrophic. The city's economy depended more on manufacturing than on financial speculation. But the secondary effects, arriving in waves over the following months and years, proved catastrophic for criminal enterprises built on discretionary spending. Gambling is, at its core, an entertainment expense. People bet when they have money beyond what is required for necessities. When a factory worker earns 30 shillings weekly and spends 20 on rent and food, he might risk 2 or 3 shillings on the horses, hoping for a windfall that could transform his circumstances. But when that same worker sees his hours cut, when unemployment threatens, when every shilling must be carefully allocated to survival, gambling becomes unaffordable luxury rather than reasonable entertainment. Watch what happens at a Birmingham racecourse in 1931 compared to 1925. The crowds are smaller, perhaps half the size they once were. The men who do attend carry themselves differently. There is less exuberance, less of the reckless optimism that fuels heavy betting. They wager smaller amounts and more conservatively. The bookmakers' chalkboards show thinner action, fewer bets, smaller stakes. The mathematics are brutal. A bookmaker who once handled £500 in bets across a race card now handles 200. His profit margin remains roughly the same percentage-wise, but the absolute profits collapse proportionately. Where he once cleared £100 per race day, he now clears 40. The Peaky Blinders, taking their percentage from bookmakers' profits, see their revenues from racing operations fall by more than half. Multiply this across all their betting operations, and the scale becomes clear. The gang's core revenue stream, the foundation of everything they built, shrinks dramatically. From annual revenues in the tens of thousands of pounds, they fall to perhaps a third of that. And this decline arrives at the worst possible moment, as their expenses remain largely fixed. Enforcers still need paying, corrupt officials still demand their bribes, territories still require maintaining. The gang's cost structure was optimized for peak revenues, and suddenly those revenues have disappeared. Protection rackets face similar erosion. Small businesses struggling to survive cannot pay protection money they once paid routinely. A shop owner whose revenues have fallen by half simply does not have 5 shillings weekly to spare. The gang can threaten violence, but threats only work if the target has money to extract. Destroying a business that cannot pay generates no revenue, only resentment and visible evidence of decline. The gang faces an impossible choice. Reduce protection payments to levels businesses can afford, thereby reducing revenues further, or maintain payment demands and watch businesses fail or flee, eliminating future revenue streams entirely. Either choice accelerates their decline. They attempt a middle path, selectively reducing payments for some businesses while maintaining pressure on others. But this creates inconsistency that undermines their authority. Why should one shop owner pay full price when his neighbour pays half? The smuggling operations face different but equally serious pressures. The Depression reduces demand for premium illegal alcohol as working-class consumers shift to cheaper alternatives. Meanwhile, government policy responds to unemployment by reducing alcohol duties, trying to stimulate legal trade and collect any possible tax revenue. This narrows the price advantage of smuggled spirits. Previously, illegal alcohol sold for perhaps 30% less than legal equivalents. Now the gap shrinks to 15%, making the risk-reward calculation less favorable for both smugglers and consumers. Consider the operational economics. The gang's costs for smuggling remain roughly constant, bribing customs officials, transporting goods, storing inventory, distributing to outlets. But the margins shrink as price advantages narrow and volumes decline. Operations that once generated £300 weekly profit now generate 150, then 100, then barely break even. Some smuggling routes become economically unviable and must be abandoned, reducing the gang's operational scope and further limiting revenues. But these market-driven revenue declines, severe as they are, represent only one dimension of the economic collapse. Regulatory changes deliver the strategic death blow that market conditions alone might not have achieved. In 1934, Parliament passed the Betting and Gaming Act, fundamentally restructuring the gambling industry the Peaky Blinders had dominated. The act legalized off-course betting for the first time, allowing licensed bookmakers to operate betting shops legally. This meant criminal gangs no longer had monopoly control over a grey market industry. Now legitimate operators could enter, backed by proper capital, operating legally, paying taxes, but also enjoying the protection of law rather than depending on criminal enforcement. Imagine the strategic implications. Previously, anyone wanting to operate as a bookmaker needed the Peaky Blinders' protection because they operated outside legal frameworks. Now, a licensed bookmaker could call police if threatened, could use courts to collect debts, could advertise openly, and operate without fear of criminal interference. The gang's core value proposition, providing security in an illegal market, suddenly had no value in a legal market. Worse, the licensing system created barriers that kept the gang out of the newly legitimate industry. Licenses were granted to applicants with clean records and legitimate business backgrounds. Men with criminal convictions, which most senior gang members now had, were explicitly excluded. The very success that had made them dominant in the illegal market disqualified them from participating in the legal one. The racecourses, always the most visible and lucrative operations, faced immediate transformation. Licensed bookmakers began appearing with proper stands, professional operations, and confidence that law would protect them. The Peaky Blinders could still attempt intimidation, but now victims could report to police without fearing they would be ignored. The political protection that had shielded the gang from consequences began eroding as legitimate bookmakers, now tax-paying, licensed businesses demanded actual law enforcement. The gang's response was to double down on illegal operations, focusing on unlicensed betting and maintaining presence at smaller, less regulated venues. But this meant competing for a shrinking share of a declining market. Licensed bookmakers were taking the most profitable business. The gang was left with scraps operations too small for legitimate operators to bother with, serving customers too poor to attract licensed competition. Revenue from racecourse operations, once £10,000 annually, fell to £3,000, then £2,000. The profit margins that had sustained the empire simply evaporated, and this occurred across all betting operations simultaneously, a systematic destruction of their core business model that no amount of violence or intimidation could reverse. Competition from more sophisticated criminal organizations further accelerated decline. While the Peaky Blinders struggled with collapsing revenues and regulatory disruption, other gangs adapted more successfully. In London, the Sabini organization transitioned partially into legitimate gambling operations, acquiring licenses through fronts and intermediaries. They maintained criminal activities where profitable but diversified into legal enterprises that provided both revenue and respectability. Other criminal organizations modernized their operations in ways the Peaky Blinders found difficult to match. They adopted professional accounting systems that tracked revenues and expenses precisely, allowing better resource allocation. They developed centralized management structures with clear hierarchies and division of responsibilities. They invested in political connections at higher levels, cultivating relationships with members of parliament and senior civil servants, rather than just local councillors and police sergeants. The Peaky Blinders, by contrast, remained wedded to older organizational methods. Their record-keeping was informal, based on personal relationships and verbal agreements rather than systematic documentation. Their management structure remained personality-driven, with leadership positions held by men whose authority derived from reputation and history rather than demonstrable competence in changing conditions. Their political connections, while once substantial, had not evolved to match the more sophisticated corruption networks their rivals commanded. This created a competence gap that grew wider over time. Criminal enterprises increasingly required business skills, financial management, strategic planning, risk assessment that the Peaky Blinders' leadership lacked. They were superb at violence and intimidation, effective at managing street-level operations, but they struggled with the complexities of a criminal organization operating in an increasingly regulated, competitive environment. Market share in Birmingham's remaining illegal gambling operations shifted steadily toward newer, more adaptive criminal groups. Small operators who once paid tribute to the Peaky Blinders began looking elsewhere for protection, finding rivals who offered better service at lower cost. The gang's territorial control, once absolute, became contested. Streets that had been undisputedly theirs now saw competing criminal interests operating openly. The gang attempted to resist through traditional methods: violence against rivals, intimidation of defectors, doubling down on enforcement in core territories. But violence alone could not solve fundamentally economic problems. You cannot beat market forces into submission. You cannot intimidate customers into having money they do not possess. You cannot threaten regulatory agencies into abandoning policies implemented by Parliament. Each violent response to economic decline created new problems. Police, facing pressure from licensed bookmakers and legitimate businesses, could no longer afford to ignore gang violence. Arrests increased. The political protection that had once shielded gang members from consequences weakened as politicians responded to changing public attitudes. Working-class communities, once tolerant of or even supportive of the gang, grew resentful as protection payments became unbearable burdens during economic hardship. The financial strain created internal crisis. The gang could not maintain payment levels to members when revenues had collapsed. Enforcers who once earned £5 weekly now received £2 or less. Corrupt police who expected regular bribes found payments arriving irregularly or not at all. This undermined loyalty throughout the organization. Members began looking for alternative employment, either with rival gangs or in legitimate jobs that depression conditions made scarce but still preferable to declining criminal earnings. Leadership attempted diversification into other criminal activities, loan sharking, theft, fraud, but these required different skills and different networks than gambling operations. The gang discovered that expertise in one criminal domain did not automatically transfer to others. Their attempts at loan sharking were inefficient, generating less profit than professional operators while requiring substantial capital to fund. Theft operations lacked the sophistication of established criminal receivers who knew how to move stolen goods efficiently. Some members proposed transitioning into legitimate business, using accumulated capital to purchase pubs, shops, or small manufacturing concerns that could provide legal income. This made economic sense, but it faced enormous obstacles. Most gang members lacked business management skills. Their criminal records made obtaining licenses difficult. Banks were reluctant to lend to known criminals, and critically, legitimacy required abandoning the very methods violence, intimidation, and corruption that the gang knew best. A few individuals managed this transition successfully. Some opened pubs that operated legally, though often serving as fronts for continued criminal activity. Others invested in property, becoming landlords who collected rent through legal means, even if they supplemented income with illegal activities. But these were individual successes, not organizational transformation. The Peaky Blinders as an entity remained fundamentally a criminal enterprise, and criminal enterprises built on gambling faced systematic economic destruction during the Depression. By the mid-1930s, the mathematics had become undeniable. Annual revenues that had once exceeded £20,000 now struggled to reach £5,000. Expenses, while reduced through cuts, still consumed perhaps £4,000 annually. Profit margins that had been enormous now barely existed. The gang was no longer a thriving criminal enterprise, but a struggling organization maintaining presence through momentum and reputation rather than genuine economic power. This economic collapse created a strategic vulnerability that law enforcement was finally positioned to exploit. Detective Inspector Farnsworth's unit, which had been building cases methodically for years, now found opportunities that had not existed during the gang's peak. Members desperate for money were more willing to become informants. Corrupt officials, receiving reduced or no payments, became less reliable in protecting the gang. Businesses, resenting protection payments they could not afford, began cooperating with police investigations. Farnsworth shifted focus from trying to prosecute the gang for violence, which remained difficult due to witness intimidation and evidentiary challenges, to financial crimes that could be proven through documentation. Tax evasion, fraud, operating illegal gambling operations now that licensed alternatives existed. These charges were easier to prove and harder for the gang to defeat through traditional methods. The first major prosecution came in 1936, when several senior gang members were charged with operating illegal betting operations in competition with licensed bookmakers. The evidence was documentary records of bets taken, money collected, operations conducted without licenses, No witnesses needed to testify. The case was built on paper, and paper could not be intimidated. Convictions followed, with substantial prison sentences. This removed experienced leadership from the organization at exactly the moment when strategic vision was most needed. The remaining leadership lacked the sophistication to navigate the gang through its economic crisis. They continued trying to solve problems through violence, when the problems were fundamentally economic and regulatory. More prosecutions followed in waves. The police unit had built comprehensive intelligence on gang operations, and they prosecuted systematically, targeting key members across different operational areas. Each conviction weakened the organization further. Each imprisoned leader created succession problems and strategic confusion. By 1937, the Peaky Blinders existed more as reputation than reality. They still controlled some territory in Small Heath, still operated some illegal gambling, still collected some protection payments, but they were shadows of their former dominance. Revenues had collapsed by 80% from peak levels. Membership had declined as men found other opportunities or other gangs. The territories they once controlled absolutely now saw multiple competing criminal interests operating simultaneously. The economic logic that had enabled their rise had reversed completely. Where once they had exploited power vacuums and unregulated markets to build empire, now they struggled against market saturation and regulatory frameworks designed explicitly to eliminate criminal control. Where once they had optimized operations for maximum profit extraction, now they struggled to cover basic operating costs. Where once they had commanded loyalty through generous profit distribution, now they could barely pay members enough to prevent defection. Economic decline had accomplished what law enforcement alone never could, destroying the Peaky Blinders' organizational capacity, undermining their internal cohesion, eliminating the competitive advantages that had made them dominant. The Depression had removed their customer base. Regulation had eliminated their market. Competition had taken what remained. And all of this occurred simultaneously, creating converging pressures that no criminal organization, however sophisticated or violent, could withstand. The empire was not merely cracking now, it was collapsing, rapidly and irreversibly. The economic foundations had crumbled, and without economic foundations, everything else, the violence, the corruption, the reputation, meant nothing. Criminal organizations are, at their core, economic enterprises. When the economics fail, the organization fails. The mathematics are simple and brutal and unforgiving. The Peaky Blinders were learning this lesson in the hardest possible way. Their reign was ending, not with dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but with quiet economic strangulation that made continued operation simply unsustainable. The question now was not whether they would survive, but how quickly they would disappear, and whether they would leave any legacy beyond cautionary tales about overreach and failed adaptation. Organizations deinstage us. First comes denial leadership, insisting that setbacks are temporary, that traditional methods will eventually prevail, that reputation and determination can overcome structural disadvantages. Then comes desperate adaptation, frantic attempts to find new revenue sources, cost-cutting that damages operational capacity, strategic compromises that would have been unthinkable during prosperity. Finally comes acceptance, the cold recognition that continuation costs more than it returns, that the rational choice is dissolution rather than endless struggle against inevitable defeat. The Peaky Blinders progressed through these stages during the late 1930s, their organizational death occurring not through single catastrophic defeat but through accumulated failures that made survival impossible. By 1938, the gang's operational territory had contracted dramatically. Where they once controlled districts spanning much of eastern Birmingham, they now held meaningful power only in Small Heath, and portions of Bawdsley, their original heartland, now a refuge rather than a launching point for expansion. Even within these core territories, their control was contested. Rival criminal organizations operated openly, sometimes in uneasy coexistence, sometimes in open conflict. The absolute dominance that had once characterized their rule had dissolved into fragmented influence, where multiple powers competed for diminishing resources. Walk through Small Heath in 1938, and you would see the visible signs of organizational decay. The pubs that once served as gang headquarters showed neglect, paint peeling, windows occasionally broken and not immediately repaired, the confident swagger of members replaced by wary watchfulness. The bookmakers at local racecourses operated with far less prominence, their stands smaller, their operations more furtive. The businesses that once paid protection money regularly now often delayed payments or negotiated reductions that the gang, lacking alternatives, accepted reluctantly. The gang's membership had declined precipitously. At peak strength, they commanded perhaps 200 active members with another 300 to 400 associates and sympathizers who could be mobilized when needed. By late 1938, active membership had fallen below 50. Some had been imprisoned. Detective Inspector Farnsworth's prosecutions had removed perhaps 30 members to various prisons across England. Others had died, killed in gang conflicts, succumbing to injuries from violence, dying from disease exacerbated by poverty and risky lifestyles. But most had simply left. They found legitimate employment where possible, despite depression conditions making jobs scarce. They joined rival criminal organizations that offered better prospects. They relocated to other cities, where their Birmingham reputations carried less negative weight. They retired from active criminal life, living quietly on whatever savings they had accumulated during more prosperous times. This membership decline created cascading problems. With fewer enforcers, the gang could not maintain control over the territories they still nominally claimed. With fewer operators, they could not manage the criminal enterprises that generated revenue. With fewer members, they lost the critical mass that had once made them formidable. When you could mobilize 50 men for a confrontation, rivals thought carefully before challenging you. When you could barely muster a dozen, you were vulnerable to any serious opposition. Leadership succession problems that had been brewing for years now reached crisis proportions. Thomas Gilbert had been imprisoned in 1936 on charges of operating illegal gambling operations. His sentence, 5 years, removed the gang's most sophisticated strategic thinker at exactly the moment when strategic thinking was most needed. Ernest Bales, whose reputation for violence had once maintained discipline, had grown older and lost the physical edge that had made him feared. By 1938, he was 43 years old, suffering from war injuries that had worsened with age, still dangerous but no longer the terrifying enforcer he had been at 25. Harry Fowles had been killed in 1937 during a confrontation with a rival gang in Coventry. The details were disputed. Some said he was ambushed while meeting a contact. Others claimed he walked into a trap set by former allies turned enemies. But the result was undeniable. Another key leader gone, taking with him decades of operational knowledge and the personal relationships that had helped hold the organization together. The remaining leadership consisted largely of second-tier members who had never expected to command the organization. They were competent, operators in specific domains, managing betting operations, collecting protection payments, maintaining relationships with corrupt officials, but they lacked the vision and authority to lead the gang through existential crisis. Their meetings, once focused on expansion and opportunity, now revolved around managing decline, which territories to abandon, which operations to close, which expenses to eliminate. Internal disputes that had been suppressed during prosperity now erupted openly. Arguments over who deserved what share of diminishing profits became bitter and personal. Some members accused leadership of hoarding resources, while ordinary members suffered. Others suspected that senior figures were negotiating private deals with rivals or police, preparing to betray the organization to save themselves. Trust, the essential currency of criminal organizations operating outside legal frameworks, eroded rapidly. The gang attempted various desperate measures to restore revenues and relevance. They tried expanding into loan sharking more aggressively, lending money to desperate workers at extortionate rates. But they discovered that Depression-era borrowers often could not repay, forcing choices between writing off debts or using violence against people who genuinely had nothing. Violence generated no money, only resentment. Write-offs undermined the credibility that made loan sharking viable. The operation lost money consistently. They attempted labor racketeering, trying to insert themselves into unions and worker disputes as enforcers or mediators. But Birmingham's labor movement had its own established power structures and deeply resented criminal interference. Several gang members were beaten by union organizers when they tried to collect fees for their services. The gang, weakened and distracted, could not respond effectively. They retreated from labor operations, having accomplished nothing except advertising their vulnerability. Some members proposed joining with rival gangs, merging operations to create a larger, more viable organization. These negotiations occurred sporadically throughout 1938 and 39. But mergers require trust and clear value propositions. The Peaky Blinders had neither. Rivals viewed them as declining assets whose membership and territory were not worth absorbing. The negotiations revealed humiliating reality. The gang that had once commanded respect through strength now could not even attract interest as merger candidates. Law enforcement pressure, meanwhile, continued relentlessly. Farnsworth's unit had by this point built comprehensive files on virtually every active gang member. They knew where members lived, who their associates were, what operations they conducted. Prosecutions occurred regularly, not spectacular mass arrests, but systematic targeting of individuals for specific crimes that could be proven convincingly. Tax evasion, operating illegal gambling, assault charges that survived witness intimidation because victims were carefully selected for their willingness to testify. Each prosecution removed another member, often for substantial prison time, and the prosecutions demonstrated that the gang's protective measures no longer functioned. Corrupt police officials, no longer receiving reliable payments, became less willing to risk their careers protecting criminals. Political allies, responding to changing public sentiment and their own financial pressures, distanced themselves from associations that might prove embarrassing. The corruption network that had once seemed impenetrable had dissolved through economic strangulation and strategic law enforcement pressure. The gang also faced a new and unexpected threat from recovering legitimate economy. As Britain began emerging from depression conditions in the late 1930s, employment opportunities improved. Young men who might once have viewed gang membership as their best economic option could now find factory work, apprenticeships, even military service. The gang's recruiting pool evaporated. The few young men who did express interest in joining were of notably lower quality, desperate, unskilled individuals who brought more problems than solutions. Then came September 1939, and with it, the Second World War. The declaration of war transformed Britain overnight, including Birmingham's criminal underworld. The conditions that had enabled the Peaky Blinders' original rise, chaos, weak law enforcement, economic opportunity in grey markets, reversed themselves as the nation mobilized for total war. Military conscription claimed gang members along with everyone else. Young men received call-up notices and had no choice but to report. Refusing conscription was a serious crime that guaranteed imprisonment, and unlike peacetime sentences, wartime imprisonment meant harsh conditions with no political protection. Most members of military age reported for service, disappearing into training camps and eventually overseas deployments. This removed virtually all of the gang's remaining young members, the enforcers, the operators, the future leadership. The men who remained were either too old for military service, medically unfit, or in reserved occupations. This was not a group that could maintain criminal operations requiring physical capacity and risk tolerance. War also eliminated many of the economic opportunities that had sustained criminal enterprise. Rationing and price controls removed profit margins from black market operations. Smuggling became vastly more difficult as port security intensified to prevent enemy infiltration. Gambling, while not eliminated, became more heavily regulated and monitored as governments sought to control all economic activity for war purposes. Licensed bookmakers operated under strict supervision. Illegal operations faced immediate prosecution, with guaranteed convictions and harsh sentences. Law enforcement, meanwhile, gained new powers and resources. Police could arrest suspects with minimal evidence under emergency regulations. Trials proceeded quickly, without the lengthy processes that had once allowed gang lawyers to find technical defenses. Sentences were severe. Judges viewed criminals as traitors undermining the war effort, parasites exploiting national crisis. The tolerance for organized crime that had existed during peacetime vanished completely. The Peaky Blinders faced a choice that was really no choice at all. They could attempt to maintain operations under wartime conditions that made criminal enterprise nearly impossible and extremely risky. Or they could effectively dissolve, with members pursuing legitimate opportunities or at least ceasing organized criminal activity. The rational calculation was obvious. Continuing offered almost certain arrest and imprisonment with negligible profits. Stopping offered freedom and the possibility of surviving the war to potentially resume operations in better times. The dissolution was not dramatic. There was no final meeting where leadership formally disbanded the organization. No declaration of defeat or surrender. Instead, the gang simply stopped operating. Members drifted away. Operations ceased without formal announcements. The pubs that had served as headquarters returned to being ordinary drinking establishments. The territories they had controlled fell to other organizations, or remained uncontrolled as all criminal activity contracted under wartime pressures. Some members joined the military, serving in various regiments, a few even distinguishing themselves in combat. The skills that had made them effective criminals, capacity for violence, loyalty to comrades, functioning under pressure, translated surprisingly well to military service. Several died in combat, their criminal pasts forgotten or unknown by the men who fought beside them. Others found employment in war industries. Birmingham's factories converted to munitions production, creating demand for workers that far exceeded supply. Men who had been unemployable during Depression now found themselves valuable employees in essential industries. The wages were good, the work was steady, and crucially, no one asked difficult questions about criminal pasts when the nation desperately needed production. A few elderly leaders remained in Birmingham, living quietly on whatever savings they had preserved, occasionally meeting in pubs to reminisce about past glories. Ernest Bales survived into the war years, working in a factory despite his age and injuries, never arrested for his past activities, eventually dying in 1943 from pneumonia, a mundane end for a man who had once been among Birmingham's most feared criminals. Thomas Gilbert was released from prison in 1941, his sentence reduced due to wartime labour needs. He worked in munitions production, never returning to criminal activity, surviving until 1967. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to researchers about the old days, providing some of the few first-hand accounts of the gang's operations, though time and self-interest had surely coloured his memories. The gang's accumulated capital, the money they had earned during their peak years, largely disappeared. Some had been invested in properties that provided modest, legitimate income. Some had been spent during the lean years of decline. Some was simply lost, hidden caches, forgotten, money buried or stashed that was never recovered. A few former members emerged from the war with modest financial security, suggesting they had preserved some wealth, but none became wealthy. The fortunes they had accumulated during their criminal prime had evaporated. By 1945, When the war ended and Britain began confronting the immense task of reconstruction, the Peaky Blinders existed only as memory. The name survived in police files and newspaper archives. A few elderly men still alive could remember seeing them at racecourses or paying them protection money, but as an operational criminal organization, they had ceased to exist years earlier. The dissolution was so complete that tracking precisely when the gang ended becomes impossible. Unlike corporations that file dissolution papers or armies that formally surrender, criminal organizations simply fade away when maintaining them costs more than they return. The Peaky Blinders stopped being a functioning entity somewhere between 1938 and 1940, not through dramatic defeat but through accumulated failures that made continuation irrational. Some organizational remnants persisted. Small-time criminals still operating in Small Heath occasionally invoked the gang's name, hoping to trade on faded reputation. A few protection rackets continued in diminished form, but these were individual operators or small groups, not the coordinated organization that had once dominated Birmingham's underworld. They were echoes, not substance. The rational actors who had built the Peaky Blinders, who had recognized opportunities in post-war chaos and exploited them ruthlessly, ultimately made the same rational calculation about dissolution. When continuation became unsustainable, they stopped. When legitimate opportunities exceeded criminal prospects, they pursued legitimacy. When the cost-benefit analysis shifted decisively against organized crime, they abandoned it. This is perhaps the most important truth about the Peaky Blinders' end. They were not destroyed by moral awakening or heroic law enforcement or rival gang dominance, though all these played roles. They dissolved because the economic and strategic logic that had enabled their rise reversed itself. They were creatures of specific historical circumstances. When those circumstances changed, they could not adapt, and so they disappeared. The empire built through. Violence and sophistication ended not with battle, but with spreadsheets, not through defeat, but through simple unprofitability. The men who had once commanded Birmingham's underworld found themselves middle-aged workers in munitions factories, indistinguishable from millions of other Britons grinding through wartime sacrifice. Their criminal past became mere biography, remembered if at all as youthful indiscretion in chaotic times. The Peaky Blinders were gone, and Britain, consumed by existential war, barely noticed their absence. Consider a paradox. The Peaky Blinders, as an operational criminal organization, disappeared so completely by the mid-1940s that most Birmingham residents under 40 had never heard of them. Police files gathered dust in archives. The men who had been members lived quietly, their criminal pasts known only to themselves and perhaps immediate family. The territories they once controlled showed no visible traces of their dominance. By any reasonable measure, they had been forgotten, a minor footnote in Birmingham's history, no more significant than dozens of other small criminal gangs that briefly flourished and quickly faded. Yet by the early 21st century, the Peaky Blinders had become a global cultural phenomenon. A television series bearing their name attracted millions of viewers worldwide. The gang's aesthetic, flat caps, razor blades, tailored suits became instantly recognizable fashion iconography. Their story was analyzed in documentaries, explored in books, referenced in popular culture across multiple continents. Dead criminals who had been utterly forgotten were now entertainment commodities generating hundreds of millions of pounds in value. This transformation represents one of the most remarkable resurrections in cultural history, and understanding how it occurred, how forgotten criminals became globally recognized brands, reveals profound truths about storytelling, nostalgia, and the economics of myth-making in modern media cultures. Begin with the historical reality which remained obscure for decades. The actual Peaky Blinders operated primarily from the 1880s through the 1910s, with a resurgence in the immediate post-World War I period that lasted until the mid-1920s. They were predominantly young men, teenagers, and those in their early 20s engaged in petty theft, assault, protection rackets, and street violence. They were dangerous, certainly, and at times genuinely feared in their neighborhoods, but they were not the sophisticated criminal empire that later depictions would suggest. The name itself, Peaky Blinders, remains somewhat mysterious in origin. Some accounts suggest it derived from the flat caps they wore, with peaks pulled low to blind victims during attacks. Others claim the name referenced the practice of sewing razor blades into cap peaks as weapons. Still others argue it was simply street slang for a particular style of cap popular among working-class Birmingham youth. The truth is probably mundane. They were young criminals who wore fashionable caps, and the dramatic name emerged through a combination of self-mythologizing and newspaper sensationalism. Their actual exploits, documented in police records and newspaper accounts from the period, were considerably less romantic than later portrayals. Court records show arrests for petty theft, assault, public drunkenness, illegal gambling. Newspaper accounts describe street fights, protection rackets targeting small businesses, occasional violent confrontations at racecourses. These were serious crimes that caused real suffering, but they were not the stuff of epic criminal sagas. The gang's actual leaders remain somewhat obscure. Thomas Gilbert exists in historical records as a gang member arrested multiple times. Ernest Bales appears in police reports. Harry Fowles is documented in various criminal proceedings, but we have no photographs of most of them. No detailed biographical information, no first-hand accounts of their personalities or motivations beyond brief police descriptions. They were criminals who lived and died without leaving substantial historical traces. What we do not find in historical records is any mention of a Shelby family running the gang. Thomas Shelby, Arthur Shelby, Polly Gray, the central characters of the television series are entirely fictional creations with no historical basis. The television show borrows the gang's name and rough historical period, but invents virtually everything else, creating a narrative that has only the most tenuous connection to historical reality. This matters because understanding the transformation from reality to legend requires recognizing the enormous gap between the two. The historical Peaky Blinders were small-time criminals of limited impact who are largely forgotten within a generation. The fictional Peaky Blinders are sophisticated criminal masterminds, navigating complex political intrigues, commanding significant resources, interacting with historical figures, from Winston Churchill to Oswald Mosley. These are not merely different versions of the same story, they are fundamentally different stories that happen to share a name. The resurrection began with historian Carl Chin, who conducted research in the 1990s exploring Birmingham's criminal underworld in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chin's work brought the Peaky Blinders back into public consciousness, documenting their activities through archival research and establishing them as a genuine historical phenomenon worth studying. His books and articles provided the foundation of knowledge about the actual gang, rescuing them from complete obscurity. But Chin's historical work, thorough and valuable as it was, reached primarily academic audiences and local history enthusiasts. The Peaky Blinders might have remained a minor historical curiosity known mainly to Birmingham locals and criminal history specialists. What transformed them into global phenomenon was the creative vision of screenwriter Stephen Knight. Knight, born in Birmingham and familiar with the city's folklore, recognized something crucial. The Peaky Blinders name and rough historical framework provided perfect material for prestige television drama. The post-World War I setting offered rich thematic possibilities: traumatized soldiers, social upheaval, the collision of Victorian sensibilities with modern brutality. The Birmingham location provided distinctive atmosphere different from the London-centred crime dramas that dominated British television, and the gang's relative obscurity meant he had freedom to create without being constrained by audiences' existing knowledge. Knight made strategic creative decisions that transformed historical material into compelling narrative. He moved the gang's peak activity period from the 1880s through 1910s to 1919 through the 1930s, aligning them with more dramatic historical events: the Irish War of Independence, the rise of fascism, economic upheaval. He invented the Shelby family, creating charismatic fictional characters with complex motivations and sophisticated criminal operations. He emphasized aesthetic elements: the flat caps, the tailored suits, the razor blades that created instantly recognizable visual iconography. Most importantly, he framed the gang not as petty criminals, but as working-class heroes navigating a corrupt establishment through intelligence and controlled violence. Thomas Shelby, the show's protagonist, is a traumatized war veteran trying to build something meaningful from chaos, protecting his family while battling forces more powerful than himself. This framing transforms criminal activity into something viewers can root for, not because they approve of violence and crime, but because the narrative positions the gang as underdogs fighting corrupt systems. This represents sophisticated storytelling that understands modern audiences' relationship with crime narratives. Contemporary viewers, particularly in the post-2008 economic crisis era when the show debuted, harbored deep cynicism about establishment institutions. Banks, politicians, police, all are viewed with suspicion as corrupt or compromised. A story about criminals who acknowledge their own corruption while fighting against hypocritical establishment figures resonates powerfully with these sensibilities. The show also tapped into nostalgia for a particular kind of masculinity: physical, direct, loyal to family and friends, operating by clear codes even when violent. Thomas Shelby, played by Cillian Murphy with carefully calibrated intensity, embodies this masculinity while being complicated enough to avoid simple stereotypes. He is brutal but thoughtful, violent but strategic, criminal but bound by certain principles. This character type appeals across demographics: men who aspire to traditional masculine virtues, women attracted to the combination of danger and vulnerability, audiences of all kinds drawn to morally complex anti-heroes. The aesthetic choices proved crucial to the show's success. The costume design, tailored three-piece suits, flat caps worn at precise angles, pocket watches and collar pins, created a distinctive visual style that translated easily into fashion and merchandising. The cinematography emphasized shadows, smoke, and architectural lines, creating atmosphere that felt both historical and timeless. The music, anachronistically mixing period-appropriate orchestration with contemporary rock and hip-hop, signaled that this was historical drama reimagined for modern sensibilities rather than staid period recreation. These elements combined to create what marketing analysts call a franchise, a coherent brand identity that could be extended across multiple platforms and products. The television show was merely the anchor. Fashion lines produced Peaky Blinders-inspired clothing. Bars adopted the aesthetic, serving cocktails in period glassware to customers wearing flat caps. Tourism in Birmingham exploded, with Peaky Blinders walking tours and themed experiences. Books, both fiction and purported history, proliferated. The economic value generated by the franchise reached into hundreds of millions of pounds. This represents the ultimate irony. Criminals who generated perhaps tens of thousands of pounds annually at their peak, whose organization collapsed when revenues fell below costs, have been transformed into a brand generating vastly more wealth than they ever criminally extracted. The economics of nostalgia and entertainment proved far more lucrative than the economics of actual crime. But what strategic lessons does their actual history, the reality rather than the fiction, offer to students of organization, power, and adaptation? Several emerge with particular clarity. First, successful organizations exploit specific environmental conditions. The Peaky Blinders rose because post-World War I Birmingham presented ideal circumstances: weak law enforcement, unregulated markets, trained soldiers with no legitimate opportunities, a political distraction. They did not succeed through superior virtue or exceptional ability, but through recognizing and exploiting systematic opportunities. When those conditions changed, law enforcement strengthened, markets regulated, economic conditions shifted, their advantages disappeared. Organizations optimized for specific environments rarely survive when environments transform. Second, corruption provides only temporary competitive advantage. The Peaky Blinders built extensive networks of corrupt officials, which protected them effectively for years. But corruption networks are inherently fragile. They depend on continued payments, which require continued revenues. When revenues collapsed during the Depression, corrupt officials became unreliable or actively hostile. Corruption also creates documentary evidence that can be used for prosecution when political winds shift. The gang discovered that buying protection is not the same as owning it when they could no longer pay. Protection evaporated. Third, violence has severe limitations as organizational strategy. The Peaky Blinders used violence extremely effectively for intimidation and enforcement. But violence cannot solve economic problems, cannot create markets that do not exist, cannot force customers to have money they lack. Organizations that rely primarily on violence rather than genuine value creation face fundamental strategic constraints. They can dominate in specific contexts, but cannot adapt to changing conditions that make violence less effective or more costly. Fourth, diversification requires genuine competence transfer. The gang attempted to diversify from gambling into loan sharking, labor racketeering, and other activities as their core business declined. These efforts largely failed because skills that made them effective bookmakers did not automatically make them effective in other criminal domains. Organizations cannot simply declare they will enter new markets. They must develop actual capabilities relevant to those markets. The gang's belated attempts at diversification came too late, and with insufficient understanding of what the new domains required. Fifth, succession planning separates sustainable organizations from personality-dependent ones. The Peaky Blinders built their organization around specific individuals whose authority derived from personal reputation and relationships. When these individuals were imprisoned, killed, or aged out, no systematic succession process existed. The organization fragmented because it had never developed mechanisms for leadership transition. This is a common failure in criminal enterprises, but also in many legitimate organizations that confuse personal charisma with institutional capacity. Sixth, regulatory changes can destroy even dominant organizations. The 1934 Betting and Gaming Act transformed the entire competitive landscape the gang operated within. Legal alternatives emerged that offered better service and security than illegal operations. The gang found itself competing not against other criminals but against legitimate businesses backed by law, capital, and respectability. Organizations built around regulatory arbitrage, exploiting the gaps between legal and illegal face existential threats when regulations changed to eliminate those gaps. Seventh, timing matters enormously. The Peaky Blinders rose during a specific window when conditions favored their model. They declined when that window closed, despite their organization being more sophisticated and better resourced than when they started. Success is often less about excellence than about operating during favorable conditions. The strategic lesson is recognizing when conditions that enabled success are shifting and adapting before the shifts become irreversible. The gang's story also teaches lessons about law enforcement strategy. Traditional reactive policing, responding to individual crimes, arresting individual criminals proved largely ineffective against organized crime. What eventually succeeded was intelligence-led systematic approach, financial investigation, coordinated operations across jurisdictions, targeting organizational capacity rather than just individual members, patience to build cases over years rather than seeking immediate visible results. Detective Inspector Farnsworth's methods, though specific to his era, established principles that modern law enforcement still follows when combating organized crime. Perhaps most profoundly, the Peaky Blinders demonstrate that historical reality and cultural legacy are entirely separate phenomena. The actual gang was relatively minor, their impact limited, their existence brief. Yet their cultural legacy, the stories told about them, the meanings attributed to their existence, the entertainment and economic value extracted from their name, vastly exceeds their historical significance. This reflects something fundamental about how cultures process history, not as objective record but as raw material for meaning-making and storytelling. The television show's success reflects contemporary concerns and desires more than historical reality. Audiences are drawn to stories about working-class resistance to corrupt establishments, about loyalty and family in uncertain times, about individuals maintaining honor codes in morally ambiguous situations. The Peaky Blinders, as reimagined by Stephen Knight, provide a narrative framework for exploring these themes. The historical accuracy is almost irrelevant. What matters is the story's resonance with contemporary audiences seeking certain types of narratives. This creates a curious situation where two entirely different Peaky Blinders exist simultaneously. The historical reality, preserved in archives and scholarly works, and the cultural fiction that has captured global imagination. Most people who recognize the name know only the fiction. The gap between these versions matters to historians committed to accuracy, but is largely irrelevant to the millions who engage with the story as entertainment rather than history. There is something both troubling and fascinating about this transformation. Real criminals who caused real suffering have been sanitized into entertainment commodities. The violence they inflicted is aestheticized, their victims largely erased from narratives that focus on the criminals themselves. The show occasionally gestures toward the moral complexity of celebrating criminals, but ultimately it invites viewers to identify with and root for characters engaged in activities that would be reprehensible in reality. Yet this, too, teaches something about human storytelling. We have always mythologized outlaws, rebels, and those who operate outside social rules. From Robin Hood to Jesse James to modern anti-heroes across all media, cultures create stories about rule breakers that serve psychological and social functions regardless of historical accuracy. The Peaky Blinders join a long tradition of criminals transformed into legends, and the process of that transformation reveals as much about contemporary culture as the historical reality reveals about the 1920s. Standing here in the present, looking back across a century at both the reality and the legend of the Peaky Blinders, what do we see? We see men who exploited chaos to build temporary power, who used violence and corruption to dominate local criminal markets, who failed to adapt when conditions changed and subsequently disappeared almost without trace. And we see storytellers who recognized the narrative potential in that forgotten history, who created compelling fiction that resonated with modern audiences, who built entertainment franchises worth vastly more than the criminals ever stole. Both stories are true in different ways. The historical Peaky Blinders teach lessons about organization, strategy, adaptation, and the limitations of violence. The cultural Peaky Blinders demonstrate the power of storytelling, the economics of nostalgia, and contemporary fascination with morally complex anti-heroes. Neither version invalidates the other. They simply operate in different domains, serving different purposes, speaking to different aspects of how humans make sense of past and present. The ultimate lesson may be this: success and failure, power and impotence, remembering and forgetting are not necessarily connected to historical significance. The Peaky Blinders failed as criminals but succeeded as legends. They built nothing that lasted but created a name that endures. They generated modest criminal profits, but ultimately enabled the creation of entertainment worth hundreds of millions. Their actual story is minor, but the stories told about them have reached millions worldwide. In the end, perhaps that is the most strategic insight of all. Legacy is not determined by what you actually accomplish, but by the stories others tell about you afterward. The Peaky Blinders, in both reality and fiction, remind us that history is not what happened, but what we collectively decide to remember, reimagine, and retell. And in that process of retelling, forgotten criminals can become cultural icons, minor thugs can become sophisticated masterminds, and failure can be transformed into legendary success. The razor blades may never have been sewn into those flat caps. The empire may never have been as grand as portrayed. The men may have been far less remarkable than the legends suggest. But the legend, once created, takes on a life independent of reality. And that legend, more than any historical truth, shapes what most people know and believe about the Peaky Blinders. They were criminals who disappeared, and then, decades later, they became immortal. The story of that transformation may be the most fascinating story of all,